Hey, this is Sarah speaking up for Group 1, Hannah, Santi, and Nathan. How are you guys doing? I am here to talk with you about nonverbal communication. What is the big deal? Why should we, sending Cornerstone University students overseas, even talk about nonverbal communication when really all you need is the language, right? Well, not exactly, because communication covers a wide spectrum of things. It's so much more than just language. The broadest and most specific definition I've seen is this: a symbolic, interpretive, transactional, contextual process in which people create a shared meaning. Now, notice nowhere in this definition does it mention language. Actually, it's mostly not language. It's symbolic, interpretive, transactional, meaning there are two parties involved. Something is being transferred between them. One person is interpreting, the other person is trying to understand it, and it's happening in a specific context. Now, the goal of communication in all contexts is understanding. If one party is trying to get another party, is sending a symbol, to another party and they're not getting it, then communication is not happening. So, the goal in communication is understanding. But why is this important? Well, frankly, because us Americans live in a pretty explicit culture. We kind of say it like it is, there's not much that's inferred, whereas other cultures are more implicit. That's where the nonverbal communication becomes so much more important, and same with the social context. For us to say it like it is may seem downright rude or otherwise unnecessary in another culture. And unfortunately, we tend to do that pretty naturally, in the same way we read nonverbal communication very naturally. So if we want to break from our kind of American centralized concepts of what nonverbal communication means, then we gotta learn about others. So we're gonna look at two studies in the duration of this project here, and both of them kind of operate under the premise that nonverbal communication is important. We know that. So what else do we need to know about it? Okay, great, it's important. What can be studied, though? Is it just facial expressions? Is there more to it? And this first study is a perfect example of just how many ways we can communicate nonverbally. And it's entitled Nonverbal Channel Use in Communication of Emotion, and we pulled it from the American Psychological Association Journal in 2011, and there's a list of authors there for you. And basically, in the set of two different experiments, they claim that certain emotions are best expressed through certain nonverbal channels. And we'll dive into that a little bit more, but it's basically saying that a particular emotion like anger is best expressed through facial expressions as opposed to something in the body. And again, they use two different experiments from both sides of communication, both sending signals, so someone is asked to stand there and display sadness, and receiving and interpreting signals, so a subject is asked to look at a picture and say, okay, what sort of signal are they sending out? How do you interpret this? So let's first look at the different emotions that the experimenters looked at. You'll notice that 7 of these are actually the prime emotions and are the emotions found in the movie Inside Out, ironically. You see anger, disgust, sadness, fear, and joy, which they kind of named happiness, plus some others that are easily expressed non-verbally. And the different channels they asked subjects to display those in are the face, the body, and through touch. Now again, this experiment is kind of coming from the premise that nonverbal communication is already important. In fact, they mentioned Darwin himself noticed the redundancy by which humans firstly nonverbally express a mood or emotion, and secondly clarify or affirm that emotion with speech. So clearly speech is not the most important part of communication here. Okay, well, if that's the case, then how do we communicate, and how do we best communicate? And that is what they did when they looked through the specific channels. And here's what they found. Participants favored the body for emotions such as embarrassment, guilt, pride, and shame. And that actually makes a lot of sense. When you see someone who is very embarrassed, usually the first thing they do is they crunch up and their shoulders come in and they look down. They try to look as small as possible and their body kind of shrinks up. Same thing with pride. If someone with pride walks into a room, you know it right away. Their chest is held high, their head is held high. So that particular channel is most preferred by the subjects for those emotions. Whereas anger, disgust, fear, and happiness was the channel that was most used. Oh my goodness, there's a cat behind me. Sorry about that. The channel that was most used was the face. And again, this actually makes a lot of sense. When we're angry, usually the first thing that happens is our eyebrows kind of narrow in, or disgust, our face scrunches up. So intuitively, that makes a lot of sense. And then finally, for both love and sympathy, we refer to physical touch. And what researchers were trying to look at here is there an association between these groups? Is there a way we can categorize these? And the answer is yes. Notice that survival emotions, being anger, fear, and disgust, were most conveyed naturally and effectively using the face. So subjects, when asked to display fear, naturally displayed it in their face, is basically what the study found. And the other area that they were looking at for the body was actually more displayed in social status situations. So if someone's embarrassed or guilty, that's happening in a very specific social context. Same with pride. They want people to know that they are feeling these things, and so their whole body shows it. And then for the third category, areas of intimate emotions are conveyed most naturally and effectively using touch. So again, there are a lot of different categories, a lot of different ways people communicate non-verbally, and this is just one way to categorize it and kind of study it, looking at it through a specific lens. Now let's look at exactly how scientific this particular study was, kind of moving through the checklist. The subjects for this particular study were actually university psychology students, so predominantly American, though some were from a Hispanic background. The second experiment was pretty much the same sample, 86% Caucasian, 6% Hispanic, and both sample sizes were somewhere between 40 and 50 people. So, all in all, not a huge experiment, but for what they were trying to show, what they were trying to categorize, it was just big enough. Again, the subjects were randomly assigned. Each student had equal opportunity to participate, whether they wanted to or not. And psychology students certainly do cover a wide array of people, male, female, whole 9 yards. And while this experiment didn't have a particularly controlled group, there were some controlled variables, notably in the social situations. There was no particular context given to the subjects. They were placed in a situation that was neutral in both cases. The results, again, very empirical. There are some numerical data as far as which channels people preferred and which emotions that they showed, etc., etc. And so to summarize the results of Experiment 1, systematic links were found between particular emotions and nonverbal channels used to produce them. And they used cluster analysis, actually, to kind of figure out how this different data associates with each other, what different correlations they are, and these are the results that they came up with. Alright, now moving on to our second study is actually moving to the classroom. Now, if the goal of communication is shared understanding, there is nowhere more important on this earth than in a classroom for that to be true. We want teachers to be able to communicate effectively with students. Now, this study was actually a survey study. It just questioned both teachers and students on the use of different nonverbal communication practices. Let me get back to the right side here. There we go. So again, the major objective of the study was to explore the significance of nonverbal communication in the teaching and learning process. And the results were pretty unanimous, revealed both categories of respondents understood the importance of nonverbal communication skills in teaching and learning, and they considered this skill more efficient and attractive than conventional teaching. And what they mean by conventional teaching is basically just a dry lecture. And looking more in depth at this study, the sample size, there were 20 different government secondary schools, 10 boys and 10 girls selected from the urban and rural areas in the district in Pakistan. So this study was interesting because they aren't American schools, and even for a culture that is a lot more implicit than our own, nonverbal communication is of course extremely important. And so the sample comprised of 2 teachers and 40 students from each school, selected from an even larger pool of randomly selected teachers and students. So very, very objective. There wasn't necessarily a control group, although again we can assume that conventional teaching could be considered the control group of just dry lectures, no nonverbal cues whatsoever. And there are also controlled variables. The study narrowed down to facial expressions, eye contact, body movements, spatial distance between teachers and students, pitch of voice as well. And again, the results found that both teachers and students understood this. Teachers especially, and I can kind of speak from experience on this, as an education major, are very much trained to understand and behave nonverbally with students, and this can be used by proximity. If a student is misbehaving, you might not have to speak with them at all, you simply have to walk closer to them. Or even in pitch of voice, as this experiment looked at, if I say, could you please sit down and be quiet, that has a very different connotation than could you please sit down and be quiet. And the student will understand the difference between the way I just said those two things. And even though they're verbal in the sense that I'm using speech, the nonverbal part comes in actually the pitch of my voice. My words didn't change, but the pitch did, and that can have a huge effect on classroom management, which can have an effect on learning. And here are some other kind of reaffirming different studies of the importance of nonverbal communication in schools. Nonverbal messages have about a 93% impact, and in the context of that, the context of this particular study, it means the vast majority of teachers and students said, yes, this is important. Pitch of voice also arouses emotional and psychological feelings, again, as I just displayed with my previous example. Spatial distance between teachers and students is essential. And also body gestures as punctuation marks in communication is important. I once had a science teacher, when he noticed the class was kind of getting bored, all he did was hop up on top of one of the lab tables. It's really all he did. It wasn't to illustrate a point, it wasn't anything, but because he did something with his body that was so unconventional, like why is our teacher walking on the desks, all of a sudden we were all listening and we could all remember the lesson the next day. But of course, even with these two studies and looking at them, we see nonverbal communication is important. We see there are many different facets to it, and there are many different ways that we can study it and learn from it cross-culturally. We have to remember why we're doing this in the first place, and I think that goes straight back to the Great Commission. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. In this verse we see the words making disciples and teaching, both of which we just need to be able to communicate effectively for. And without nonverbal communication, then our scope is extremely narrow, especially in those cultures that aren't really like us, that don't use a lot of verbiage to express what's going on. So this concludes our presentation. Here's our works cited page. If you wanted to look at any of those studies more in depth, please go for it. They are kind of monster studies, which is why I didn't go into too much detail. But yeah, either way, there it was. Hope you have a great rest of your day.